Great to see you all today. We're going to do a speed round of some of the highlights of the book. We published The Broken Rung a couple of months ago. It reached number 4 across all book categories on USA Today, actually over the course of a couple of different weeks. So I'm excited to share with you some of these insights. I also have the worst allergies I've ever had, so bear with me as I power through this. But on your tables, and please grab one because we're going to do no pages, which if you know consultants, this is a rare moment. But we're just going to kind of cover the 2 main highlights of the book, and then we're going to go chapter by chapter and just hit the highlights and how they might guide you or a friend, a daughter, across their career journey. So, The Broken Rung, what is it about? The Broken Rung is the fact that at the entry level in the United States, and we see this around the world, for every 100 men who are promoted, there are 89 white women, 86 women overall, but only 64 Latina women and 54 black women. So for every 100 men promoted to that first manager role, about half of that for black women promotions. That is the Broken Rung. And if you think about what the talent pipeline looks like across companies, looks like this. About 70% of employees are at that entry level. Many of them never actually make it beyond that, never do get promoted. They might stay an entire career at that entry level. And so everybody has to go through that broken rung. Some lucky few, like you, might kind of make it to both, middle vice president, senior vice president, eventually even C-suite roles, those direct reports to the CEO, but everybody has to make it through that initial broken rung. The talent pipeline in the United States across industries looks quite skewed. So it starts off at almost 50-50, so 48% of that entry level is women across Fortune 500 companies. But even that reflects a lot of drop-off because women today in the United States, and actually most developed countries around the world, are about 59% of college degrees, 70% of valedictorians, higher average GPAs, majority of master's degrees, majority of PhDs. Women academically have been outperforming men, like literally blowing the lights out for decades. It's been about 40 years. So why is it that we get 59% of college degrees, and then all of a sudden, even at that entry level, we're down to 48%, and then when we get to that first manager role, we're already down to 39%, just over 1 in 3. Then it drops by 3-5 percentage points every single promotion level to senior vice president, ultimately C-suite. So around 29% of the C-suite, direct reports to a CEO in US companies, is a woman. So just over 1 in 4. But even that belies a bit of the balance of power in the typical C-suite because women are much more likely to be heads of HR, CFO, CIO, chief legal counsel, important critical support function roles, but they're much less likely to run the biggest P&L or the biggest business unit. Why does that matter? Because right now, across Fortune 500 companies, we have 10% of those CEOs who are women. It used to be 5%, then it was 7%, then for a brief moment it was 8%. We have been now, for a little bit, at 10% of Fortune 500 CEOs who are women. If we want to actually break through that 10% ceiling, we have to shift the line role or profit and loss role leadership roles versus support function roles because almost 99 to 100% of the time, when you promote a CEO from within, you promote them from running the biggest profit and loss group or the second biggest profit and loss group, not typically a support function role. So at one time in history, there were more men named Michael leading Fortune 500 CEO kind of organizations than women. Then there were more men named John than women CEOs. We do need to break through that 10% ceiling. So that's the first notion we want to talk about. That is the broken rung or the definition. It's tougher for women. It's even tougher for women of color. If that's the problem, despite our kind of academic achievements, what's the solution? The solution is what we call experience capital. And experience capital is a fancy name for saying the wisdom, experience, knowledge that you all build on the job. So we looked around the world and across a number of different countries, roughly it breaks down to about 50-50. Half of your lifetime earnings comes from the education and what you bring to your first job. The other half comes from experience capital, what you learn on the job. Now that, of course, differs by individual. It also differs by country. So in the United States, where we have higher average levels of education, more of our lifetime earnings comes from education, less from experience capital, versus in India, where it's the flip. It also differs by occupation. If you're a doctor, lawyer, engineer, some of these jobs where even to get the first role, it requires many years of education, then more of your lifetime income will be from that education versus a plumber or waitress where more of it's from experience capital. And do you learn how to be a manager? Do you learn how to launch your own restaurant and kind of build on those skills or not? So experience capital is our solution. I think if women can build more and equal experience capital to men, we will catch up in terms of our career progression and pay. You all might know there is a 27-cent pay gap in the United States. So for every dollar that men get, women get about 73 cents. And we can explain about 80% of that gap. So 20% is unexplainable. Could be bias, could be just data and factors that we can't actually measure. But the 80% that we can explain comes from two sources. A third of it comes from less time overall working. So for every 10 years men are working, women on average are working 8.6 years. This is because we're taking more breaks and longer breaks, typically around child-rearing years, so not a huge shock. The other 2/3 of the explainable pay gap is from the choices we make around our jobs. So women, when they jump jobs, are much more likely to decrease in income quintile. Men are much more likely to increase in income quintile. Now, that could be because we're choosing less competitive jobs, less typically in sales or where the competition is very transparent. I know how I did this week versus you versus last week, for example. But we also may be trading off things for flexibility, for deeper alignment with our values, right? All of those are great things, and if you make those decisions knowingly and you trade off your pay for things that are aligned with what your values are, wonderful. But if you're not making those choices knowingly, that's where I have a problem. So for example, in the United States, we used to have pretty much all male nurses. And then a number of decades ago, women started flooding into the nursing field, and now we have pretty much all female nurses. Now, when that happened, the average salary for nurses relative to other occupations went down. Similar thing for teachers. That's when it's not really a choice. It's not a knowing trade-off in choice. It's more kind of bias at play in some of these job markets. So the question then is for all of us, for your friends, for daughters, how do you navigate across your career so that you're building experience capital every step of the way and you're maximizing that? If you choose to trade that off for other things that are important to you, by all means do it knowingly, but we need to build that experience capital at a faster rate. So if you flip to the back of your one-pager, I'm gonna give you some highlights across, actually each of the chapters of the book is a little circle on this page. And I'm gonna do that in 3 discrete kind of buckets. The first bucket is decisions that somebody early on in their career would be making. How do I choose the right company? How do I choose the right occupation? How do I make the right job jumps? Those kinds of things. Then we'll get into across the career, what are all of the skills that we all need to build more of? This is across decades. And then finally, at the end, preparing for the inevitable. How might you, as a woman or person of color, be more likely to face bias? What do you do then? A motherhood penalty we'll talk about. I don't think that's me, but it could be. It's okay up here. Or the foundation of your experience capital and health. So we'll talk through all of those highlights. But let's start first with this first third at the top. So when you're picking a company, what is the number one thing that you can do to maximize your experience capital? Actually, more than choosing the right occupation, more than picking the right boss, it is picking the right company. If you do this well, it could stick with you for 20, maybe even 30 years. And so what does the right company do? Number one, it's correlated with 50% higher lifetime earnings. And the right company does 3 things. Number one, it invests in your learning and development, whether it's days like this or a certain 10%, 15% of your time that you're kind of going out and learning. Could be kind of standard training and development models at certain periods of time. Second, in addition to kind of learning and development, they invest in cross-functional rotations. So you don't just start in finance and end in finance 30 years later. You actually take different roles in different departments, different groups. You see the problem, you see your company, you see the industry from very different perspectives, and that will stretch what we're gonna talk about, which is skill distance. It stretches your skills, it builds and grows you in different ways so that you can maximize that experience capital. And thirdly, the companies that do this well have a very clear strategy. And you can tell this relative to how are they doing versus competitors in the marketplace. If companies have those 3 dimensions, they are what we call a people and performance winner. And you're likely, especially if you join them really on in your career, then you have your entire career to benefit from that learning. If you think back, kind of leadership factories like a GE, like an IBM, like a Pepsi, right, that are famous for creating leaders over decades, those are some of the things that those companies do. So the number one thing you can do is pick the right company. Another thing you can do is make bold moves. And so what is a bold move? We measured the typical job jump. When somebody moves to a new job, about 25% of the skills they use are new. They didn't use them in their last role. So think about 25% as the average, what we call skill distance, or percentage of new skills that you're using. Now, anything more than 25% is what we call a bold move. You're really stretching yourself. And if you can reframe that, not to, oof, I'm really uncomfortable, this is a stretch, I've never done this before, but more to the positive, which is, this is a stretch. And this is that moment where I am building my experience capital at a higher rate than I have in a long time. It's uncomfortable, but this is actually great for me. That kind of stretch in building of skills is one of the best things you can do for your career. So these bold moves are more than 25% new skills. Interestingly, I wasn't sure before we looked at the data, women and men make the same number of bold moves across a career. On average, 1.7 bold moves per decade. So they're not very common. And frankly, they sound exhausting, right? So good that they're not happening all the time. But when men make a bold move, they're much more likely to increase in income quintile, and women are much more likely to decrease in income quintile, perhaps because they're trading off flexibility or they want to move away from a sales job or other things. The third piece is what we call the power alley. And think of this as the cash register of your company, of your industry. You'll hear people say, stay close to the cash register. This is a profit and loss role. Just over a third of men start in the power alley. Just under a third of women start in the power alley. If you do start there, your lifetime income is likely to be 20% higher. So another kind of really important thing to shape your earnings potential. But even if you don't want to stay in the power alley, let's say you don't like sales and you don't like the transparency of the competition, at least experience it for a couple of years, because that perspective can help you so much as you bring it to other roles in the organization. So the power alley in tech would be in product management, product development. In other companies, it's usually in sales, distribution. In consulting, it's being a consultant. It's basically how your company makes money. So get in the power alley or stay in the power alley for a bit. That will help you quite a bit. And then finally is going where the jobs are. Given generative AI, given consumption trends, given demographic trends, there are a lot of different forces at work shifting occupations. There's a whole bunch of occupations growing. There's a whole bunch of occupations shrinking. The jobs that are growing, healthcare, no surprise, STEM, and transportation, which includes last mile delivery like your Ubers, Amazons of the world. So growing. If you pick one of those jobs, the wind will be at your back. There will probably be more and more opportunities, and you will have gotten in early, so you'll have more experience than most other people in that occupation. There's 4 occupations that actually drive 80% of the jobs that are shrinking, and they are dominated by women in particular. Customer service and sales. So in the contact centers, you all hear about self-service, a lot of the automation, right? These jobs are going away at alarming rates. First they were offshored, now they're just disappearing at alarming rates. Food service, waiters, waitresses, bartenders. Office administration, so assistants, receptionists, we need some, but far less than we did before. Women dominate those 3 occupational categories to a great degree, and as a result are 50% more likely to have to change jobs in the next 5 years due to Gen AI, demographic changes, and consumption shifts. The 4th category is more male-dominated, production or manufacturing, but as you net all of that out, women are still 50% more likely to need to change jobs. So those are some of the decisions early on in your career that one might make. Maybe you made them the right time the first time around. If not, now is the best time to kind of remake them in the right way. But now let's shift over to skills. And these are skills that you're going to need across an entire lifetime. The first is what we call networking or the multiplier effect. Now, women and people of color we tend to be over-mentored and under-sponsored. Lots of advice, but when it comes to really creating an opportunity for me that didn't exist before, that happens less frequently for women and people of color. Our networks are also more narrow and more junior than men, and we're 5 times more likely to have an entirely female network. And I thought, I kind of like the women in my network, maybe that's okay. But you combine that with the talent pipeline that we saw, and very few women at the senior levels, and in fact, those few senior women who are there are sponsoring both more men and more women each, so they are overtaxed in terms of sponsorship. So both less likely to be senior, and there's just too much that they're trying to do on a sponsorship basis. So how do we equalize the playing field in terms of building our networks? Particularly because 70% of jobs are not even posted. So back to those bold moves. If you want to make a bold move, it's probably somebody who knows you, who's going to bet on your potential to rise to the occasion and stretch yourself, probably through a network in finding those jobs. The next two categories are technological skills and what we call soft skills or social and emotional skills. And we took 800 different occupations, broke them down into the underlying activities. And for every activity, we asked two questions. One, can it be automated given the technology that exists today? And two, should it be automated given the wages of the people doing that work? So what makes sense to automate here in the US? Very different than Bangladesh, different than China, et cetera. And when we added all of that up, about a third of our activities could be automated away today, but we'll also all need more of two particular skills in quite a bit more volume. One is technological skills, and I don't mean can you code, because frankly, Gen AI can code better than I will ever learn to code, but more can you interact with technology to understand the implications on your work, on your team, on your company? Can you become a power user, or even in some cases, a translator? So how do you get comfortable with technology and generative AI, right? That now famous quote of it's not, Gen AI that's going to take your job, it's somebody who knows how to use Gen AI who's going to take your job. So how do you be that person? The other piece is around soft skills, and I don't even like the name soft skills. It's these social and emotional things. It includes everything from negotiation to empathy, to building relationships, to inspiring a team to achieve something that's really difficult. When you think about the differentiators from good versus incredible managers, that's the soft skills, right? Almost never is it, they had such technical know-how that was an incredible leader. And so also because this is very complementary with generative AI, we're all gonna need more of these soft skills. In fact, it's the #1 skills category that's increasing in the United States and most developed countries around the world. There's this myth that you're either born with it or you're not, right? Like you either have empathy or you have EQ or not. But in fact, studies have shown you can identify these skills and build them more systematically. And then finally, entrepreneurship. And this could include quitting your job and becoming a full-time entrepreneur. We know a number of women do that. When they do, their businesses tend to be under-financed, either from a bank loan and certainly venture capital, right? Venture capital funding for women businesses is in the 2% range. But even if you're not gonna quit your job and do that full-time, how do you show entrepreneurship within a larger company? How do you start an initiative, launch a program, build a business, or launch a new product, right? All of these are skills that we'll all need more of over the next 5-10 years. Let me wrap us up in this third and final section, and then I'm just gonna open it up for any questions you have. But in this bottom third here, confronting bias head on. And so the book, and each chapter in the book will give you some stories interwoven with some of the facts and data and the insights. We're heavy on the insights today. But I love bias and resumes because it's the closest thing to a scientific experiment that we can all do. I can show you all exactly identical resumes, same font size, same font type, same bullet points. All I change is the name at the top, John Doe versus Jane Doe. And men, and the kicker is women also, will ascribe greater leadership and higher future potential to John Doe. Because we've been so socialized in our notions of what leadership looks like. It's male, typically it's tall and white, and we don't kind of recognize neither of these people exist. We literally fabricated these resumes for testing purposes, but that shows to you kind of bias out there in the world. Now, if I give you John Doe resume, exactly identical to Jamal Doe resume, or an African-American name, that black candidate's 50% less likely to get called in for an interview. That is worth an 8-year experience penalty for that black candidate. John Doe versus Muhammad Doe, or a Muslim American name, 4 times less likely to get called in for an interview. And so we see this bias very clearly, but that's not the only type of bias that we want to talk about. There's also internalized bias. What have I internalized about people like me? And what it shows is if you associate women with family more strongly, men and women are more likely to hire a male candidate for the job, even when equally skilled. So the bias is kind of in lots of shapes and forms. If we shift over to the motherhood penalty or the motherhood chapter, let me give you back that same resume, John Doe versus Jane Doe. And on the Jane Doe resume, I'm just gonna change one bullet point. I'm gonna put active parent-teacher association member, or some signal that she is an active parent. Men and women assume she's going to prioritize being a parent, and that's 87% less likely to get called in for an interview because we're all thinking she's not prioritizing her work. About 3/4 of Americans across the board actually think men prioritize work more than women. Around the world, if you compare women with children to women without children, women with children are much less likely to get the job, much less likely to get the raise or the promotion. When you compare men with children to men without children, men with children are much more likely to have higher income. They're more likely to be viewed as trustworthy, stable, more likely to stay at the company, and the impact goes up the more children men have. So there's a motherhood penalty and a fatherhood bias, or fatherhood bonus rather, and it's exaggerated as you get to more and more children. So in light of that, how do we think about maternity leaves, right? How do you plan for a maternity leave? What do you do while you're out? How do you on-ramp and accelerate so that you're not losing momentum and you can keep building that experience capital? We see even a 2-3 year gap on a resume can increase or can affect kind of lifetime earnings by about 20% on average. So that's the motherhood piece. And then I'll wrap us up with the final bit, which is preparing for the inevitable, the health component. So women on average live longer than men. Wonderful news. We also live 25% more years in poor health. And I didn't realize this until we did the research. We're living 25% more years in poor health, and we're also often misdiagnosed. So the way a heart attack shows up for a woman is typically more like indigestion versus, we see the movies and it's like clutching your heart and tightness of the chest. But that's how doctors are often trained. So we tend to get misdiagnosed. Sometimes our symptoms are taken less seriously, and therefore we have a higher death rate from heart attacks, even though perhaps some of the underlying factors are not as strong. So we've got more of a health burden. We spend more on healthcare across a lifetime. Not a shock, we're living longer and more years in poor health. But we also have lower retirement savings. Around the world, we have the majority of part-time jobs, the majority of part-time jobs, and the minority of full-time jobs. So we have lower retirement savings heading into retirement. We're also less likely to be involved in our financial decisions. So even when we have equal knowledge to a man, we're much more likely to say, I don't know, or not make a decision. And when it comes to your financial decisions, not making a decision is de facto making a decision. So how do we get more involved in our financial decisions, make our money work for us across a career, right? This isn't just about maximizing your career earnings. You can trade it off, but you can also make it work for you. And then making sure that it can stretch for more years and more years in poor health. That is one of the drivers why women in the US, elderly women in the US, have higher poverty rates. In Japan, it's actually quite a big challenge. But because we're not kind of matching our retirement savings and our financial involvement with that health piece. So I know that was quick highlights. Hopefully you can take your one-pager. We've kind of synthesized the insights of the book into this one page. It doesn't tell you all the stories and the anecdotes because we interviewed over 50 women around the world, different industries, different sectors, functions, and really bring their stories to life in the book about how they navigated different career points in their lives. So hopefully you'll read the book and get a sense of that. But open it up for any questions or reflections. Here and then here, please.
This is incredible information, so thank you for sharing it.
My pleasure.
It's really eye-opening. How long can I ask did it take you to find all this out and do research?
I've been doing research on this topic for about a decade, and part of the impetus for the book was every time I would share it, I felt like it was new news to so many people. And if we don't know the facts, how can we make the best decisions and trade-offs for ourselves? So I wanted to both share the data, but perhaps more importantly, combine it with stories, because that's when it becomes more memorable. But we've been doing the research for about a decade. The women's health research was more in the last 2 years.
Thanks.
Yeah, please, over here.
This is so awesome. When you were talking about basically, this just rung so clear because when you were, this last part when you said, if someone has this name, this name, this name. So I was able to participate in a program that the state of Minnesota actually had. It went through a bias basically on teaching us how not to. It's amazing how much bias you have that you do not even realize that you have. The program basically taught us how to make anyone that in the organization can do the same interview. all your questions, we created basically what our competencies are and skills and competencies for our organization. Like what are we? What do you have to have to work here? What do we want you to be able to do for your jobs, and just basic things. Honesty. These things. All of these questions were made. Rubrics were put out. No names, or you can't have a name on the resumes. Anything. My applications do not ask where you've worked, any of that. It doesn't. It says very simply, where have you worked? What are your business skills, industrial, any of the skills that are things that you do in the jobs. Doesn't ask if you're female, male. This is the price. This is what this job is. So if you're a male or a female, this is what you're going to get paid. And nobody's going to know if you're male or female. That's it. So I can do the interview, you can do the interview, you can do it, it's all the same questions. That's rated by, the rubrics has the same questions, they rate it, 3 people do it, the numbers are added. When that's done, whoever has the highest score, that's your job. That person comes in, they're integrated in, and that's it. And you got the job, you got the price, and you're qualified. If you fill these things out and you have that, you're qualified. That's it. And it's worked fabulous. And in that interview process, when it asks those questions that they were talking about, how do you like to be this? I have those in there. That's what you specifically do. You say, I like to be recognized this way. How is this? How do I learn? How do this? All that's in there initially. So all of that is taken care of prior to. Then you have a 30-day, a 90-day, a 160-day. And then you just ask those questions. So that made so much sense. I was like, okay, we're doing it right. So.
Wonderful. I know we're up against time. I'll be around in the back here if anybody has other questions or wants to get a copy of the book. Thank you.